All right, Mr. Alvaro, what do you think about independent films? And also, how frequently do you watch independent films?
Um, Less frequently than I used to. Typically, I'd say maybe if I'm watching like 5 movies a month, maybe one of them will be independent, and that fluctuates, of course, with time.
Uh, do you prefer big budget studio films or independent cinema?
Honestly, it really depends on the big budget. Like, if we're talking about something that Michael Bay directed, I'll probably pass on it. I don't, or I'll be watching it as if it's a comedy, because they're so poorly thought out. But then if you go on maybe more of like a Marvel side of things, yeah, I'll pay attention to that a bit more, and it's enjoyable. But as far as like big blockbuster movies, I think they all kind of follow a very set kind of beat by beat, um, the similar act structures, and they're all very predictable, so they can get really boring after a while. Whereas independent movies typically can throw you off guard. And in particular, I think independent horror movies are the ones that really catch my attention the most because you really don't know what to expect.
And horror is a very popular genre with independent filmmakers.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you have experienced this with horror. If it's good, it's really good. But when it's bad, it's usually an unintentional comedy.
Yeah, exactly. Those are two of my favorite genres, not unintentional comedies, but comedies as a whole. Um, so a bad horror movie can quickly become a comedy, even if the director doesn't mean, or the writers or producers don't mean for it to be. Um, but yeah, like what you said, when they're good, they stick with you. And I think for a horror movie to stick with you, that's the full intention, right? Is for you to be a little bit like jarred, or for your reality to be maybe questioned, and you have to kind of think of the whole of everything that you watched for like the next couple of days. That's when like a good movie has kind of sunk its teeth into you. A perfect example would be I recently watched Midsummer. I think it's pronounced Midsummer, but it's basically Midsummer,
Yeah.
um, with Florence Pugh before she was, big A-list or whatever list she is right now, actress. And that movie, I had no expectations. I personally don't like watching trailers. Uh, Completely caught me off guard. I love like the occult and the drug and hippie kind of commune aspects of it, and it was just like I had no idea what to expect. All I knew that it was a colorful looking movie, and they basically threw gore at me, and I was not expecting it at all. So those are my kind of go-to genres when it comes to independent filmmaking. Or if I'm watching with my girlfriend, then I'm watching like maybe more of a drama, something a little bit more romantic or whatever. And there's a lot of those too. Those are fairly popular.
What makes you pick an independent film? Uh, because when you talk studio films, you know the stars, you know the directors. With the independent films or true independent films, might
Yes,
except for mine.
I have a bit of a vested interest in yours.
I know. By
But
the way, sorry, uh, I do want to mention in my most recent film, Alvaro has been you can say a script advisor or and also a test audience, and he played many roles not behind the camera after the film
definitely
was
not behind the camera,
done.
behind the
Not behind
scenes
the
for
camera,
sure.
yeah, behind the scene.
I was definitely
The first person to
like
see the film, the first person.
oh, I didn't actually know that till now. That's interesting.
You were
So I
actually
saw I saw like one of the first cuts, right?
yeah, you were the first person outside the crew, cast and crew, to watch the film.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, that's cool. That's actually quite an honor. Um, the things that will bring me to, I think maybe unfairly would be like the reputation behind it. So, um, and again, it really depends on what people consider like a independent film, right? So I saw Parasite before it was nominated for so many Academy Awards.
Hmm.
And at the time, I was like, this looks to me like straightforward, not straightforward, like in the sense of the story, but like based on what it looks like, production value, look like a run of the mill, so to speak, independent film, maybe on the higher end of production. But I knew it was, international. It was Korean made film, or even like Hereditary, um, maybe not considered a pure independent film, but I had heard about it through the grapevine from like YouTubers that I watch, um, or Reddit. I follow like a lot of different subreddits about horror movies or just like different kinds of media like that. Um, so there's a bit of like an influence from, I guess you could call them influencers. I personally hate that term, but definitely a lot of YouTubers I follow that will talk about the film industry as a whole, but in particular, I like their takes on what to watch as far as like what's not on my radar, which is typically independent films. On most people's radars, they're not really like front and center. So I try to pay attention to what other reviewers or other critics are saying about, especially about the smaller end on the scales of like budget wise.
So when you watch an independent film, what are the common issues you notice with these films? Because with big budget, the issues are a little different. They're criticized in a different way. But with
Mhm.
independent films, the whole ball game is different and the way they're seen. So what are the main problems you see with independent films?
The main thing I think, and it kind of comes down to like the experience of the directors or the producers or even the actors to a certain degree. I think the main thing is having a fluid story structure, um, and being able to put that vision on screen and edit it properly. So there's going to be a lot of times where you're watching a movie, especially for someone like me who's watching it and trying, people try to kind of guess what's going to happen in movies, but based off of what either something you see in the background, it could be a prop or it could be like um, maybe an extra that someone you'd think is not a main character, but that ends up being like one of the main parts of the movie. But more in particular, it's usually like something that someone says that seems like it's not really relevant. It seems like, oh, he's just said that in passing, or something that's mentioned, or like, oh, remember that time and blah, 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 or they're like referring to something that you don't see. And then maybe you see it on screen later, but it was something that was referred to in passing, where I don't know if like the screenwriters think about it ahead of time of like, okay, everything that is mentioned or everything that is seen, everything that's in the script should have an impact somewhere.
Mhm.
And I think it's not like when I'm judging a big budget film like a blockbuster or even like a rom-com, whatever it is, and they have these like loose ends that never go anywhere. That is something that is almost entirely unforgivable for something that is like a big, you know, mass release movie, or even TV shows that you think they're setting up a storyline and they literally go nowhere with it. Uh, that's something that's a lot more common with independent movies, and something I think that is just kind of part of the learning process for the screenwriters or the directors that are involved, or even the editors, because they're the ones putting it together at the end, where they might think, oh, this didn't go anywhere, maybe I should cut it out, but it might not be something that can be so easily cut out of a scene, or you might have to have something dubbed in afterwards. I think mostly it's loose ends in independent films are much more glaringly obvious. Um, I think the bigger budget films, typically the good ones at least, know where to remove things that don't go anywhere. it's the bad ones that really make it seem like it's like there's just some movies that set things up. um I think the perfect example of a really bad movie that did this so often was Tom Cruise's Mummy. It's constantly trying to set up another movie. It's like, oh, they mentioned a MacGuffin that's supposed to be a part of a bigger story. You know, they're trying to have like this building the Avengers, but in their universe, where like nobody knows. It's not even related to the first Mummy movie. It's not related to, but they're trying to make it like all feel like it's related. So it's very poorly done. I think on the independence scene, it's more often that you might see that, but I think audiences should be more forgiving for that.
Uh, I've talked about this before with you. With independent filmmakers, actually, in most cases, the director is the writer and is also the editor. So when you see, sorry, when you see one person doing all these jobs, you expect the person to know it quite well. Uh,
Exactly.
in Hollywood, the writer and the director is usually separate, and then there's a separate editor.
Yeah.
But the problem with
And then if
independent,
it's a big budget, then they have like the studio saying, "Oh, well, you have to have aliens or whatever," and they're like, oh, "All right, I guess we have to shoehorn that in somehow."
yeah, exactly. But like from my past experience, the one I told you, also in a previous podcast, uh, in the case of Akuma, where basically there was a story, there was a script, it was a good script, but because we had actors working which had different schedules, and we had to finish it in a certain amount of time. So the script was changing based on each actor's schedule. So if
Yeah.
A is not available, we go to B. If B is not available, we go to C. And the like if the scene has to be shot in the morning, then at night I'm rewriting the scene to accommodate this
Yeah.
person. With this person in that scene, although in the original script I know it's a lot better the way it was written at first. But by the time like we got here, it's changed. This is not the actor that I needed. Now I'm putting this character in this situation. And I'm not gonna say it's a very common thing, but it does happen a lot. It also happens a lot with the slightly bigger cast films. When you have a smaller cast in independent films, it's a lot more convenient to work with actors, but the more actors you get, the more problems you'll end up having.
Yeah, you'll have scheduling conflicts and availabilities. Or, oh, I'm working on this project in, you know, overseas, and I can't make it to your, production or where you're filming, just because, especially now is a different story altogether because of COVID. But like in general, I think that's probably why we don't see as many like um, smaller scale, whether you call them TV shows or mini series, because it's so hard to have a full vision and working with such tight constraints, whether it's timelines and availabilities, or even just like, oh, I only have 4 hours of the day to film because it's supposed to be set in the evening when it's, sundown or whatever. And then you have like 2, maybe 3 days tops where you can actually make that particular scene work for that particular time frame. And then you have to just kind of improvise, for lack of a better word, not improvise on site, like in the scene itself, but as a writer, you have to go back and you have to be like, okay, well, that couldn't work this way because actor A isn't available. So you have to change everything, and that changes the entire vision of the long term. Like it's the long term that you have to look at in big picture. Your whole vision might have completely changed just because one bad day of filming.
Exactly. Uh, that's one scenario. But even with some smaller films that don't have a lot of actors, also have a very small crew, the director is doing everything. The director is the producer, writer, editor, even the cameraman.
Yeah.
because there's a lot of one-man show films too out there in the
Yeah.
independent space, mostly either no budget or extremely low budget. I know personally, I've seen many at the festivals, on streaming platforms. Like you talked about the writing issue, I have noticed there have been a lot of very ex- like really good, interesting concepts. And I'm sure all those films I saw which had screenplay issues were great on paper.
Yeah.
Execution went wrong. And this is something that I've experienced as well. I have made my first film, I think, was a really good film, but the execution went bad, and I take full blame for that. Uh, but that's something that happens quite often with independent films. And I'm talking more in the $10,000, or let's widen the window a little more. Let's make it like 25,000 and below films. And since you know a lot about writing in general,
Mhm.
what kind of tip would you give to people, like what to focus on? Because it is easy to go off track, that's one thing, but when writing, especially when you're doing a concept film, or if you're picking a specific subject, like you'll be talking about chickens at the beginning, but by the climax it's going to be about an elephant.
Yeah. Yeah. Or that's where
Some
you're trying to subvert the expectations, right? I think the biggest thing is trying to trim the fat as much as possible. Um, it comes down to the efficiency, right? Because if you're already working with limited amount of time, limited amount of resources including the people that you're working with, resources including any props that you might have, then you need to be as efficient as possible. Don't introduce a character if that character isn't actually going to add to the plot in any sort of meaningful way. Don't introduce, don't mention anything from that happened in the past or anything that the character's interested in, unless it's for the purpose of building it up towards something. Like, I don't need to know, like, let's say if you're watching a movie about a family, I don't need to know if the main character's son is a fan of football, unless there's going to be something that actually matters in that sense for the character or for the plot as a whole, that has anything to do with football. Like,
Mm.
it doesn't, it might, like, oh, you can think it creates a bit of a character background. Yeah, it can, but it can't be just that, right? It can't just be like, oh, Johnny likes football, and then 5 scenes later Johnny's dead, but nothing had anything ever to do with football or sports as a whole. So it just feels like a lot of the times it's just, maybe it's not filler, it's not on purpose filler, but it's like something that is only really serving one purpose, where it should be try to be like multifaceted, right? Like, um, being as efficient as you can with having whatever you say on the film or whatever is shown in the background to actually have it matter as far as the plot devices moving it forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess it's as simple as, like, keep it simple, but nothing is really simple. I think the main thing is trying not to bloat, over bloat the storyline, having loose ends that go nowhere. This is just one of the most frustrating things as an audience, to see, like, oh, cool, maybe they mentioned that one thing because it's going to have an impact on the way that the actors relationships progress together, or their characters relationships progress together, and then those characters don't even have any sort of rapport with each other for the rest of the film. It just makes no sense. It doesn't really serve anything to the plot.
Like this is a problem, I would say, with independent filmmakers. I have this problem too. And not just independent filmmakers, I think it's a problem with people that write, especially like when you're writing a film, there are different stages. You start with the idea, then you write the story, then the screenplay comes in, there are one-liners. So there are different stages.
Mhm.
And you might start off with a subject or a concept. And then suddenly something happens in the world, or something happens in the world around you in your neighborhood. You're like, oh, this is a good thing that can go in the script. Then something you read on the news or you see on the TV, you're like, oh, this is perfect for my script. And then things just keep adding up,
Yeah.
and they just pile up on each other. Uh, on paper, it probably looks good most of the times, but it doesn't translate the same way on screen. Like when with the 6 films I've shot, or 5 films, I would say, one is a series. Uh, every film has been much longer than the final product.
That what you intended to be?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
And
the thing is that everything that was written was shot, except for the case of Akuma, the series, which I said, because it was way too long. We didn't have that much time.
yeah,
But with the
time
film,
constraints,
yeah, with
deadlines.
with the movies, uh, they were all longer than their actual playtime, the final draft. And it's just that we shot everything that was in the script. Also, things got added, unscripted things got added.
Yeah.
But when you see the film later, after it's edited, then you can kind of tell, okay, this is useless, this is useless. And then you start cutting things, get.
But and that's tricky too, because unless you have multiple shots of different scenes, some without that improvised part, or some um, with different that might have different things mentioned in them, then you're going to have a very difficult time editing it out without having obvious cuts. And those obvious cuts, depending on your approach to the film, sometimes it can be jarring, which can be actually helpful to the film, especially if you're doing something like horror, for example. But if you only have the one shot, or if you have one usable shot, which you might have several, but a lot of them are not usable, then there's only so much editing you can do.
Uh,
And audiences can see the edits, and you might not want them to. If you don't care if they see them or not, or if you can somehow have like something that's spliced or transitions well, where you can have someone saying something off screen, but you add it onto the fact afterwards, and it's not as noticeable, then that's fine. But it really, the limitations that you have when you put your editor hat on, you're going to have a hard time trying to
uh,
cut all of that extra stuff. Like, oh, we added this last minute. Well, then fine, you can do that, but film it originally how it was first, and then with a good shot, and then film it again with whatever you want to think that you might add on, that you might use. In all likelihood, you might not, because if you wrote the script and you were happy with it, leave it alone as much as you can. I think, especially when you're starting out, because again, the more you start adding willy-nilly here and there, the less of a fluid story that you'll actually have to tell.
but in my case, there have been times when the unscripted part came out better than the scripted part.
Yeah, and that happens too, right? And
uh,
sometimes it's a matter of trusting the actor. Maybe the actor actually has a really good read on the story, and that understands the character even better than the screenwriter might have understood them, and said, no, this character wouldn't say that. This character wouldn't behave that way. They wouldn't treat this person that way. And so you have to kind of pivot and adjust, which can make the film better. But because of all those restrictions, all those limitations and time constraints that you have, more often than not, it can make things more complicated.
so, what's your favorite independent film or a good film that has a good repeat value?
The one that comes to mind, and I don't even just answering it saying, "Oh, it's my favorite," Probably not accurate to say his favorite, but something that I can watch over, maybe not over and over again, like in the same day, obviously, but something that I recommend to especially younger people that are, trying to figure out their lives and in their teenage years or even like early 20s when they're trying to say, oh, I don't know who I am, is a really good one. Was The Perks of Being a Wallflower, where it's like a bunch of teenagers or college-aged kids trying to figure out who they are, experimenting with drugs, and I have a bit of a relation with that as far as like having something in common. Um, Really well done, and usually you don't see that good of acting from that young of actors, and that's something that stuck with me. Of like, wow, okay, I don't even know who directed it, but whoever directed it clearly put their actors in positions to succeed.
There's a film I saw. It actually released a little before my first film, in 2017, I think, or maybe this film released in 2016. It was called Blood on the Leaves. Uh,
I don't think I've heard of that.
it released on the same platform as mine. I cannot name the platform here, so we won't get into that.
Okay.
And I was, when I saw that film, and my first film released, I saw that film actually after my film released. Yeah. I was actually, yeah, this is an interesting story, actually. I don't think I've ever told you this. I was scared after I saw that film
Is it a
because I
horror movie?
liked it. No, not because it's a horror
Okay.
film, it's a thriller, but I was
Okay.
scared because I liked it. And then I looked at my film, I was like, oh no, this is my competition. My film is garbage.
Yeah,
Compared to this one. It's
that's
better
definitely something
quality.
you shouldn't recommend to anyone. Or like to try to being humble is one thing, but it's the same with any other art form, right? Like there's a lot of stand-up comedians that I follow that just refuse to watch any other stand-up, especially when they're in their creation mode, because they don't want to either feel like they're inferior. It's
Mhm.
like that, like, oh, how could I ever compete with these guys? Or because they might have like an unperceived influence where they might unknowingly adapt something or copy, for lack of better words. I don't think it's
Mhm.
copying. I think it's more adapting, um, and do a version of that where if it's done well, then it can be almost like an homage. But if it's done poorly, it's almost like it's satirical, but not even trying to be satirical. That's definitely something you should try to avoid as much as possible. You, not you, but like you, the general you, as far as like being filmmakers or even content creators, to try to be in the zone where you're in your zone and not being influenced one way or the other by external media.
See, the way I see it, my approach is, sorry, when I see independent film and I like it, I'm actually happy and I want more people to see that film. I do get
Mm-hmm.
very jealous when I see a very good independent film. When I like a film,
Yeah,
I'm jealous of the filmmaker.
yeah,
But at the same time, I want that independent filmmaker's film to do well, people to watch it, because if people like one independent filmmaker, they will go to another one. They'll
yeah,
watch another film. If they like the second one, they'll go to the third one. So
yeah.
this
Or
way,
it'll open their minds
yeah,
just in general to like let them say, there's a lot of people that would just not watch independent films. All it takes is one for them to change that
exactly.
opinion, that perception.
And also, along with that, when I like an independent filmmaker's film, I actually want to make something better than him or her. So I
Yeah,
get to challenge myself as well. Yeah, the kind of film it was. I made my first film was also a thriller, but most of the films I have made are not in that genre.
yeah,
They're different. My style is very different. Uh, it was funny how you said homage, because with my recent work, I was accused a little bit, not accused, like people are like, oh, you're trying to be like that one director. I was like, no, that's just how I see things. That's why my framing and all. You
yeah.
also
And
notice,
there's
I
similar.
think you noticed that too.
When I saw your unreleased film,
Yeah,
I mean, there's
I didn't
always
see
going to
Legacy.
be. Oh, I'm not. Yeah, I would
Yeah.
never say like I'm of the mind that like there's no original ideas, right? Like there's so many stories that have been told that there's only so many kind of templates of a story that you can
Mm.
have. It's kind of the same with music, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, when people say, "Oh, all of this music sounds the same," well, of course, it follows a specific rhythm. You know, it follows a structure of some sort, and you can't just recreate that structure out of nowhere unless you're gonna completely redefine movies and say, oh, we don't need to have a conclusion to the movie. It's just going to be the two first acts, and then it's a really weird cliffhanger. That doesn't happen. It really doesn't happen. So you're going to be influenced no matter what, especially by the ones that do it really well.
Well,
Right? Like
I'll say the name.
there's a
I'll say the name of that director.
Stanley Kubrick.
No, no, no.
Oh, okay.
It was
He's a
no, no,
huge influence.
no, no. In my work, I don't think there's any Stanley Kubrick that you can see. I said framing because
Framing. Okay.
I not the colors, but in the my last film, the unreleased one, also in some places the color ended up being like that. It's Wes Anderson
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And
because
what,
I've
of
had three
course, though,
films
because he's
where I
so
use it.
great.
Yeah, in three films. Even before I was no, I knew Wes Anderson at that time as well. But yeah, it started off like I didn't know when it became a thing with me because in my second film I had the whole framing thing going on. Uh, Actually, in all the films, this is the aspect ratio thing happened in my second film.
Mhm.
But then it's just the framing thing was always there. But my colors are very different. I don't use the creamy
Yeah.
colors.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Oh, the creamy colors look really nice.
in the new one, in a couple of scenes, I had to because it was just required to create that
Yeah.
look.
Well, yeah, you have to establish like a time frame, or you have to establish like this shot or whatever is from a different era, or if it's in the future or whatever, like depends on the kind of movie that you're looking to make. Um, and you're never gonna have anything that's a piece of art, whether it's movie or music, where it's going to be like entirely new, that just completely, you know, recreates, the entire storytelling structure of what it is. There's only so much you can do, and it gives maybe creators a bit of a limitations to a certain degree, but like there's different media for different types of approach, right? So if you want like a more long form, maybe a movie's not for you. Maybe a movie's not for that particular project that you're working on. Maybe you do like a mini series. And then again, it's a lot smaller it's a lot harder with smaller budgets because of all the time constraints and all those delays that you might deal with. But there's like a lot of movies that you can look at them and be like, that would have worked as a TV show. Uh, and vice versa. There's TV shows that are awful because they drag everything on for too much, and you're like, that would have been better if it were just a movie, right? Like, how many TV shows that don't even get picked up because they have like this long vision, but the audience is just not invested at all, and it might have actually done better as an adapted movie.
But now it's not just about movies and TV shows. Now there's another player like which came in the market, like let's say in the past decade, which is called
Yeah,
content, online content.
yeah. I guess everything is content, right? Like
This
a
online
podcast
content.
is content,
Yeah.
but yeah, I know what you mean. Especially more of the it feels like it's got a specific demographic, maybe
Mhm.
more on the side of like attention deficit types of demographics, where it's just everything is so like instant, and it has to be, give me the story in 5 minutes or I'm out. And I'm like, wow, that's a very different kind of approach.
You
Not
know,
something I particularly enjoy, but